Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on Thinking the Future. But first, I have to tell you that I have the happiest sore arm today. I had my second vaccine yesterday, and I can't tell you how relieved I am to feel at least a little bit safer in very uncertain times. So thank you so much for joining our conversation with two fantastic minds. We've got the Uber author Clem Sunter, South Africa's scenario planner, together with Mitch Ilbury, scenario planner and edutech social entrepreneur. So they have written this delightful book, which is called Thinking the Future. I hope you can see it over there. And standing on, called with the second line, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. So before Nicole asked me to do this webinar for the Daily Maverick, I had spotted it at Exclusives. It was selling like hotcakes, and I marked it as a must-buy. These are very confusing and anxiety-provoking days. We've never been through a moment like this, at least in our lives. I know there've been many pandemics, and I think this is why we have so many people joining us today. So if you layer on top of it the age of anger, which I think is what we saw in mid-July when the rioting and looting had all of us transfixed about what this meant for our country, I think it's a very apposite book. So very welcome, and thank you to Future Growth for sponsoring today's webinar. We're very happy to have you with us. Clem, very welcome. It's an honor to be with you, and congratulations on your next book.
Thank you so much, Ferial, and it's so nice to be part of this program. And I always read Daily Maverick because you have that extra vital viewpoint on the future of this country, which we discuss in the book.
Thank you. And we're passionate about our country and making it work. So in the book, Clem, you reprise your work on the fox and the hedgehog, whether to be a fox or a hedgehog, based on the first thinking, I think, of Isaiah Berlin. Could you give us a recap for those of us who may not remember it really well?
Yeah. What we're doing in this book is going through the giants behind our thinking. And in that first chapter where we introduce foxes and hedgehogs, we talk about Plato quite a lot, who felt that, real philosophy was about getting outside the cave and seeing the world as it really is. And he put everything into that particular view, whereas Aristotle, the other Greek philosopher we talk about, said you've got to actually look below you and see what's happening on the ground and gradually transform your views. And these two great philosophers were Plato the hedgehog, Aristotle the fox. But even before they lived, there was a Greek philosopher who said the hedgehog knows one thing and the fox knows many things. And we felt this was a vital distinction between forecasting on the one side and scenario planning on the other, because there are two books dominating the world at the moment. One's called Super Forecasters, and the other one is The Signal and the Noise, and they really go into how you should forecast with probabilities. And Mitch and I feel very strongly that there's so much uncertainty around that you've got to look at multiple futures, and you've got to look at the forces driving the present into each of these futures. And then you get a much better understanding of the world around you than you can through forecasting and then giving it a probability. Much better for ordinary people to play scenarios on the future of their lives and on the country and everything they're interested in than trying to bet on a single forecast, which is what a hedgehog does.
Absolutely. So, Mitch, welcome. Why is this distinction so important for now, where we find ourselves in what I often feel are unknowable times, not only here, but in the world, when you look at any day, any given day's news?
Yeah, it's very true. And I think it's something that if I look back on some of the work that I've done in the past with various corporates around scenario planning for the future and strategic thinking, a pandemic is something that they always put on the flip chart when we do the exercise, a key uncertainty that they need to monitor. But then I think they, file it away somewhere and forget about it, because no one really anticipated the depth and scale of what we're living through at the moment. In these times, it's very easy to get caught in your current context, to get very consumed by what's going on around you. Hopefully in this book, we give people an opportunity to think about the future, to lift their heads a little bit, see the bigger picture, and see how the future may unfold before them. And as Clem mentioned, it's not about forecasting. It's about seeing how the future may play out in multiple different ways. And I think what the pandemic has shown us is this is a critical skill, to be able to entertain how things can turn rapidly, change rapidly. How can you build in some kind of adaptability in your thinking such that you're more prepared for whatever may materialize?
Thank you very much. So, Clem, I'm going to quote from, and you quote it in the book, From the Mind of a Fox, which I can't believe came out in June 2001, 20 years ago. And you and Chantal Ilbury wrote at the time, yet in a hypothetical letter to George Bush, you said, yet another consequence of being one family multiplying on one earth is the growing possibility of worldwide epidemics. You cannot have healthy economies with sick people. With urbanization, migration, and the mutation of bacteria and viruses into drug-resistant forms, an old-fashioned plague of some kind which will affect everyone is looming large, and the doctor's arsenal of antibiotics is looking desperately thin. Prescient, was it obvious from your work that that's what was going to happen? Tell us what you were doing in that hypothetical letter.
Yeah, what we wanted to show was that, thinking about the future is not about saying that on a certain day of a certain year that you're going to have a plague or a pandemic.
Yeah. Because
nobody has that kind of foresight, and the precision is actually just not something you can have as a futurist. So it's much better to put the force, the driving force, the concept on the table that the world is vulnerable to a plague, just as now it is vulnerable to extreme weather events, and then you monitor that risk. And as we said in the book, it's when you get flags that are related to the risk that suddenly things become very dramatic. And we had, of course, the initial virus in Wuhan in China, yes, back in early 2020. That should have alerted the world much quicker to the possibility of a pandemic. And that's what our kind of way of looking at the future is about. We put the risk on the table, and then we watch the flags. And in the book, we have a great story about Tilly Smith, an English girl, who was taught 2 weeks before she went to Bali that if you saw the tide recede and bubbles on the tide, it could be a tsunami. And in fact, it was the tsunami of 2004, and they managed to evacuate the beach because she saw it in advance of it actually happening. So that's what being a futurist is about, is to put the risk on the table and then watch the flags.
Mitch, if you were writing a hypothetical leader to a world leader today, what would those scenarios look like?
Wow, that's a big question.
Big question.
Hopefully, and what we try to do in this book is to give them an indication of the process underpinning scenario thinking. I think when people think about futurists, they think of scenario planners and forecasts. They think of this elite cadre of people that have a crystal ball, maybe in their back pocket or in their neighborhood or in their kitchen. And they look into that and they can have some kind of firmer grip on the reality of the future than everyone else. But, that is not the case. And it's not what Clem and I talk about in this book. Rather, you need to look back to the principles underpinning futures, the principles underpinning the process of scenario planning, and then go where those scenarios show you. But ultimately, you could do a brilliant scenario planning exercise and not come up with scenarios that actually materialize at all. but the process in and of itself helps give you that preparation that's required, such that you're more prepared no matter what life throws at you. And I think world leaders today will do well to understand that. Will do well to say, we need to anticipate different things happening. We need to anticipate things happening on the geopolitical scale, on the economic scale, on the health scale. And instead of trying to predict what the future may hold, rather build in an agility into our policy making and decision making such that we're prepared no matter what happens.
Absolutely. I just want to welcome some of our audience. We're joined by 783 people. You can buy the book from our Daily Maverick bookstore. Just some, I'm afraid, Mitch, it's mostly Clem's fan club here. Okay? So it's
not surprised.
Not surprised. Julian Thompson, nice to see Clem back. Clive, hi from Clive Smith. Dwarakanathan, Rajakapal Palachari, I hope I got that right. Says now I can hear. Marius Michael with questions. Roz Mene joins us from Montenegro. Angie Goff, huge Clem fan. Hello from Cape Town. George King, Barbara Klassen, another Clem Sunter fan in Prince Albert that time. Selby Nongama, welcome. Dina Tatley, Margaret Shipton, Lynn Brown, good to have you all with us. I wonder if it's the Lynn Brown. Tumelo Mabitsela, Richard Vernon. Lovely to have you all with us. We look forward to getting to your questions, and there are quite a few of them already. So, Clem, if I could ask you, so this is a really great romp through what we can learn from the greatest minds: Plato, Socrates, the Stoics, Hannah Arendt, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King. Most people read these texts to understand our past and not our future, and yet you entreat us to do something different with them. I know it's a big question in a small time, but what does that look like?
Well, let me take the chapter we write on thinking and doing, yes. Because people are great because they change the world, and you can't just think and do nothing. And so we have this critical chapter towards the end on thinking and doing, where our two heroes are Nelson Mandela and Steve Jobs. And what Mandela did, because I saw him in prison just before he was released, he was already thinking about the future. He asked me lots of questions about what creates a successful economy. Do I think China's doing things differently to Russia and Venezuela and Cuba? It was a conversation all about the future. But the critical thing is, once he kind of worked out what he felt was the best formula for South Africa, he did something about it. When he came out, he did. He got involved in the negotiation. There was a new constitution. There was a democratic election. That's what makes you great. And with Steve Jobs, if he just thought about, changing things in his mind, but had never produced the iPod, the iPad, the Apple computer, nobody would have thought of him again. And he talked critically of thinker-doers and the fact that you've got to convert your thoughts into action. And that's what we've tried to do with every chapter, is take the giants who are most relevant. Like Darwin is most relevant when it comes to adaptation. That's how species are successful and survive. We really show how a giant is relevant for the future. And particularly, we're proud of that chapter on thinking and doing.
Can I stay with you for a moment? I get the sense that in our country, we have great thinkers and talkers, but not doers. So we have wonderful plans lying dormant, like the National Development Plan. What is it, do you think, that holds us back, either of you, from getting to the doing part and just staying with the thinking and the talking? Is it our history? Is it fear? Too many hedgehogs?
Over to you, Mitch.
I think no, I mean, it's a great point. And I think Clem, articulated perfectly. It's that relationship between thinking and doing. Because otherwise, if you think about these things, that is a great first step. And it's a critically important first step. Because otherwise you're doing without thinking, and you can get in all sorts of trouble. You can get led by your passion and your emotion. rather than rationally and reasonably thinking things through. But that relationship between thinking and doing is absolutely critical. And I don't think it's something we've got right in South Africa at the moment. I think there was a lot of excitement around Cyril Ramaphosa and what he could do, taking the country forward. And so far, I think he's done, a very decent job in terms of stabilizing things, in terms of being a mediator between the different factions in the ANC. But I think right now, understanding our current context, we need strong, bold, substantial leadership with clear direction, but then clear implementation following that. I don't know exactly what the problems are stopping him doing that outside of trying to be that mediator role within the ANC and within the country generally. And obviously he's got a lot on his plate, but there needs to be 3, 4, maybe 5 key priorities that he needs to set and put on the table and make sure that he delivers on them, because, really the future of the country depends on that.
And when you read the National Development Plan, do you see it as an exercise in scenario thinking? Because I know they did a lot of scenario work around that. I mean, is it a good document to serve as our baseline, would you say, or is it more forecasting?
Yeah, I would say that it is a good document and it's been well thought through. But what we feel now is that you need the kind of counsel that we've had for the pandemic to see us through the pandemic. We've had experts and we've had Cyril on television, every 2 or 3 weeks telling us what is in store for us. And we now need the same with the National Development Plan. We talk in the book of a scenario called People's Economy, where we create a whole new wave of entrepreneurship in this country. And we think that Cyril Ramaphosa should have exactly the same type of council, call it an entrepreneurship council, and appear on television to say how many new businesses have been created and do this regularly so that we gain momentum. Because I know that a small business is mentioned in the National Development Plan. And one of the critical points Mitch and I make in the book is that work has changed. In the last century, big business was the major creator of jobs. But now with automation and artificial intelligence and robots, big business is no longer like that. And it's small business. In America, 2/3 of the jobs being created at the moment are in small business and micro business. We've got to do the same if we want to get that terrible unemployment rate, particularly amongst the young, of 50% down to less than 5%. We've got to change the whole nature of our economy. And that's why we call it a people's economy. I did a debate with Julius Malema in 2016, which was organized by the Cape Chamber of Commerce at the Cape Sun. And I said, I'm just as passionate an economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is to do with releasing the entrepreneurs in this country, the township entrepreneurs, the rural entrepreneurs, and setting up a whole system that allows them to start businesses. And of course, some will fail, but others will succeed, and then they will become like Elon Musk, who's now the second richest man in the world. We've got so many people with talent, but we haven't got that sort of encouragement that we really need to create jobs and build up our economy.
Have you and Julius stayed in touch? And how persuasive were you over his thinking? Because he still seems pretty much state-led. I mean, the EFF's latest campaign is for state custodianship of all land, which is the polar opposite of Hernando de Soto's work, which you also refer to in the book, and that's about giving people title deeds.
Yeah, look,
very simplistically, but
it's the difference between China and Russia and the others is what Deng Xiaoping did in 1978 was 2 things. He said the state must concentrate on creating the platform, the infrastructure, the education, health, do all those things. But we must release the Chinese people to create wealth for themselves. And they were the 100th ranked economy in 1978. Now they're number 2, and they could be number 1 by 2030. So we've got to do the same. And it means we've got to have a lot of action. And that's why I would love our president to lead from the front, go on TV, have a council of people like Adrian Gore of Discovery, who's started a business and knows how you go about it. That's the kind of stuff that we need in South Africa.
Mitch, what about thinking through our biggest issue of the time? If you look at the floods in China, the raging fires in Turkey at the moment, and just a number of massive weather events. I've been reading really interesting work showing that the trajectory that people had anticipated is in fact been thrown out. It's going to be much faster. What are the challenges on that, and how can you use scenario planning to get us onto kind of a better trajectory in our country, where we still are very coal dependent and bringing in power ships from Turkey, for example?
Well, climate change is a perfect example of the importance of thinking the future effectively. If you get caught up in the challenges of today, if you get caught up into the opportunities of today about, making profit, about making sure things carry on how they have always been, then you run into the issue that, sooner rather than later, you're going to meet big existential changes in our environments. And climate change, let's not beat around the bush, is existential for our human race. So really, hopefully, people can read this book, get some of the principles out of it to lift their head, think the future more effectively, and understand the grave dangers that face us if we don't do rapid, drastic action today. And what's exciting is that all the work that I do from a Growing Foxes perspective with young people, and it's painfully evident when you watch things around the world, especially led by someone like Greta Thunberg, is that young people care deeply about the environment. They are the ones that are able to think the future more effectively, because in many ways they are the future, quite literally. And it's exciting to see, and it's promising to see, and hopefully others can take the lead from young people, think the future more effectively, and understand how we need to make very serious decisions today about what we can do to be more effective towards addressing the challenges of climate change.
Must be, like you say, must be led by young people. We've got fabulous questions. I'm just going to stick with the book for a few moments more. So who did you write it for? Corporations, organizations, governments? I found it quite a personal tool, because at the end of each chapter is a very good set of questions. I thought I might just read from some of them that I enjoyed. This is from What Can You Control? How often do you get emotionally consumed by matters beyond your control, such as the news or some drama on social media? Can you be a stoic when hearing bad news that could have implications for the future? Can you concentrate on how you should react to the consequences as best as possible? Have you ever done something that caused a chain of unexpected events to spiral out of your control? Consider your response to the pandemic and its lockdowns. Did you waste a lot of time worrying about things beyond your control and languishing at home? What are the things you discovered about yourself? These are great questions. And at the end of each chapter, there's a set like that, which I found very thought-provoking. What was your plan, Jan, and how did you mean the book to be used?
Well, we wanted to really write it for ordinary people, because all the books on scenario planning overseas have tended to be for governments and for businesses. They've been written in a very academic way. So we wanted to really produce a popular book on scenario planning. And therefore, it really is aimed at the individual. And we make a lot of examples in the book of what you can do personally for climate change when you have a meal. What is the carbon footprint on your plate? How many trips are you going to take overseas? In other words, so many of things in life are down to individuals making decisions about their own lives. And if you can get enough of them to do that, then you can really change the world. In the chapter on Stoic philosophy, we say there's that circle of control, which is quite small, but that you have, and it overlaps that big world that you don't control. But it's that little sliver between the two circles that you can influence the whole of the way that we open up as a species And Greta Thunberg showed that you can create incredibly popular movements, and social media can widen your circle of control hugely. So we're really aiming it at an individual, saying, here are the scenarios,
yes,
and here's what you can do about it. We're not saying, here's a forecast and you can do nothing about it. We're saying, here are the possible scenarios. What are you going to do about it?
And thank you. That's a real gift to us as individuals, because before, that kind of work was lodged in big corporations, extremely expensive, and you're offering us these tools. Mitch, a final question before I really want to share the lovely questions we're getting on the chat, is you did wonderful work once the pandemic started with people from across Africa, I think, on what the future of education looks like using scenario thinking. Won't you share that with us? It's from the final chapter in the book, which is called Planting Seeds.
Yeah, so last year we had an education roundtable looking at the future of education to 2030, and we invited a series of stakeholders, principals, teachers, ministers of education, students, all various stakeholders in education to ask that question from multiple different countries in Africa, in the global north, from Australia. And they were absolutely united about the problem that we face currently in education today and how it is a legacy model from the past. And they identified two key uncertainties that are going to shape the future of education. One is the relevance of education. How relevant is education in preparing young people for the future world of work and the future that they're going to be entering into? If someone's born today in 2021, they're going to be 30, just entering the workplace and, building a career by 2051. Now, that's a long way away, but how are we preparing young people for that world? Is education relevant enough to prepare them for the 2050 world? At the moment, no. The second key uncertainty that they identified was the culture of openness to change amongst educators. Now, this talks to the ministers of education, it talks to principals, it talks to teachers. Are they open-minded in changing the legacy model of the past towards preparing a better future? Those are the two key dimensions that are going to shape the future scenarios for education in South Africa and more broadly. And hopefully, by imagining these different scenarios, educators, as well as the various stakeholders, parents and young people, can come together and identify that the best case scenarios where we want to end up. Now, what are the practical steps in order to help us get there?
So I've been watching the NIDS-CRAM research on education, what happened to education during the pandemic, very, very closely. And it seems to me that it's prodded the sector into the future, but it's keeping people behind. So in fact, you've seen increased inequality with children in poor environments unable to get online to learn, skipping a hell of a lot of school, and almost the researchers say we have a new generation of massive dropouts. What would your scenarios, how would you think about that confounding problem at the moment where, in fact, I thought it was green fields for education, but actually the research is showing maybe not so much, huh?
Well, to be honest with you, it amazes me that we are in the position we're in today, because you didn't need to be a brilliant futures thinker 20 years ago to see that the future is going to be on the internet. And the future of education could leverage this incredible resource with a gateway to, a vast amounts of, almost an infinite amounts of information and knowledge out there, and how we couldn't leverage that ability to connect virtually and have that access to the information. So really, educators and educators were caught flat-footed last year, because that really came home to roost. That realization that education is not making the progress that it needs to. Hopefully, last year, the silver lining is that it's a major wake-up call for a lot of people, and educators can really put their heads to understanding how they can leverage the incredible power of technology to make education better. And government needs to step forward, as you point to say, well, what are some of the rules of the game that we need to put in play to enable that technological revolution? And broad-based access to the internet is crucial. It should be the number one infrastructure requirement from government to say, bugger all the other things, this is the one that we're going to prioritize to make sure every young person, every person in the country has good quality access to internet, because the world is on the internet, the world is technological based, and we need to come forward and realize that fact.
That could be really a game changer. Just focus on that one thing. You know, when I drive past libraries and so on in quite poor areas, and you see young people outside, even on a Sunday at all hours, just because there's free internet access, we should be doing much more on that score. Okay, then I want to get to our questions because people are having such great chats here. From George King, education is the key, a no-brainer, but do those in charge realize it, and what are they going to do about it? Look at Finland. I think we've answered that. Herman Funk, 2,000 years ago, Plutarch said, education is the kindling of a flame and not a filling of a vessel. When will we start kindling flames? I think you said we should do it yesterday, but hopefully start tomorrow. From Guy Harris, Tim Elliott, he's replying to someone. Big business is complicit with big government and big labor to protect the status quo of the oligopoly-driven economy in most sectors. Have you seen? No, I haven't. I can't read the end of that. What do you think? Do you agree with Tim there, Clem? With Guy Harris, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's the critical thing which Mitch raised in education, which is trying to make it a universal right to have access to the internet, applies absolutely equally to the economy, because you know the jobs that are being created in most places in the world are in the service area, and you know, every small business and entrepreneur needs that device to market what they have produced, but equally to do their accounts and all those kind of things. So, you know, we've got to marry education with what the reality of work is going to look like over the next 50 years to really create, as I said, a people's economy.
Thank you. And Janine Nell asks, Mitch, have you had any positive response from government/business to suggestions about internet infrastructure and the necessary interventions to reinvent education?
Well, I mean, I haven't myself, you know, opened those conversations outside of the fact that I can say, you know, even today, later this afternoon, we're launching our Growing Foxes program with the Western Cape Education Department, who have seen, you know, the work that we're doing about thinking the future and the importance for young people to think that way. And they are implementing our technological program, which is based on a web-based platform, to over 7,000 learners across the province. So, I mean, there are glimmers of hope, and hopefully it sets the scene for other governments across the different provinces to follow.
That would be great. Norman McFarlane in Somerset West. Mitch and Clem, you both suggested actions that the president ought to take to address our economic challenges. What are the flags you are obviously watching that you think should be in the front of that?
Well, let me start with you know, the flags that we talk about in the book. You know, that the president does set up some kind of entrepreneurship council and does regularly appear on television, giving us a feel for the actions being taken and the progress being made. Because actually, the cautionary tale scenario, which will flow out of doing nothing and create more anarchy, and which was shown by that terrible looting and destruction to be a viable scenario if we do nothing. Hence the risk of not doing that, treating the challenge of setting up a people's economy as even bigger than getting through this pandemic, and leading from the front on it. It's the number one flag. And then obviously other flags like, how many new businesses have we created? What are the unemployment rates looking like? Have we set up proper financial facilities for small business by, for example, e-stock markets in every single city, which are like eBay, where an entrepreneur can put his business on the internet and ask for crowdfunding? Have we got the banks together to create micro lending facilities for rural areas? Is every big company in South Africa going to, say, put 20% of its supply chain into nurturing young entrepreneurs in South Africa? because some companies have already done that.
And very successfully.
And very successfully, yes.
Banks, mining, etc.
Exactly. They've all done that. So that we're on our way on most of these things. But those are the kind of flags which will show, yeah, we really are transforming our economy into something that's really inclusive. It's not just the same old, same old.
But Mitch, after that horrible week, our society seems to be cohering around the idea of a basic income grant as the key recipe of a people's economy. And that's a very redistributive, extremely expensive, but I'd argue necessary measure. Can we do both those things, do you think? Are they mutually exclusive?
I think, but I think very real with how famous are.
Turn off your camera, please. Your sound's breaking.
Well,
can you hear me?
Yes.
Now?
The point is this: I've actually advocated in an article that a basic income grant is not a bad idea as a beginning to spread cash into particularly rural communities so that they can pay for services in or around that community. So, I don't think that they are exclusive. I think we can do all the kind of things to help entrepreneurs, but for the time being, to inject cash into the economy, particularly in rural areas, is a good idea. It's a good idea, and I think it's 35 billion or something. And I know the mining industry has put the kind of extra taxes into the paid the extra taxes which can finance this. But in the longer run, of course, you want people to think of their own lives and start their own businesses because people don't like just being helped. They want to be a success in life, and so it's more than just being given a basic income grant. But if that can help create the sort of cash required to get the small businesses on the go, fine by me.
I'll tell you an interesting story. My friend Peter Detroit wrote a book called Stellenbosch Mafia, and he tells me that the reason people have bought it in unbelievable quantities for a South African book is because they want to know how to start a business and how to become wealthy. That was really interesting to me, and I think it speaks to your point. People want to own something. Yeah,
and look, not very many people become as rich as those guys in Stellenbosch and as I said, Elon Musk. But and that's not a people's economy. There will be lots of people who perform fairly ordinary services in communities, but they're getting paid for it. And so, yes, you want some of them to break through into the national economy and go overseas and make huge names for themselves. But, in America, the average America in Oklahoma and Nevada or wherever it is, they're running small businesses. They may be doing 2 or 3 jobs at the same time. But that's what, life is going to be like these days because, as I said, big business is no longer going to be a major employer of people.
Absolutely. Nicholas King, this one's for you, Mitch. It depends on who and what you're asking. He's saying to somebody else, there's a bunch of research on Gen Zs across the spectrum of economic status that shows that they care deeply about the future and environmental issues. They're furious about the mess the world is in. Just that was a comment for you. Huh?
Yeah. I chat to young people all the time. I mean, I tour around schools across the country, and I can tell you what, it's incredibly exciting and promising to know that social justice and various ethical issues, as well as climate change, are the top on their agenda. They're things that they care deeply about. They're things that they're frustrated about, which I think we need to change. But it is promising to know that young people, the next generation, and the generations thereafter are hopefully going to be a lot more ethical than perhaps the generations that have gone before them. And I think it's incredibly important for the sustainability of humans generally that we do in order to make sure how we get along with each other from a social perspective, is managed more clearly. There's more empathy between people, but then also from our relationship with nature and climate change, I think has to change fundamentally in order for us to be sustainable as a species.
Absolutely. Any from Raymond Steenkamp Fonseca, any thoughts on crypto as a game changer?
Yeah, well, the point about the cryptocurrencies at the moment is that people are worried. They're worried about this injection of all this money around the world, which is essentially paper money, into the system as relief measures for the pandemic. And so government debt has gone up in America, in Europe, everywhere, because quite rightly, governments have had to intervene to try and help people through the misery of the pandemic. And so people are getting worried about inflation. And as soon as people get worried about inflation, they think, gosh, well, interest rates may rise, and then, there could be defaults on government debt. And so they're looking for other investments. And so the two that have come to mind is gold on the one side and cryptocurrencies on the other side. And I don't think it matters what governments do. I think that cryptocurrencies are going to play a major role in the world in the future. And the one thing that I have against them is that it's not good for climate change. The amount of carbon emissions from creating Bitcoins is enormous. It's more than a country to create a Bitcoin. So, I sort of realize that this is a major trend, but I am worried about it because the last thing we want now is to create more sources of carbon emissions.
I've got some lovely other questions. Thank you, Clem. Mark Grant sees some positives from the recent unrest. He's amazed at how quickly civil society organized itself into civil defense and how quickly the supply chains bounced back. Is that something that you've noticed as well? And what does he tell us?
Well, I'm saying at the moment, when I talk about the people's economy versus cautionary tale, that the initial looting and destruction was a big flag for cautionary tale, but then the response from the community in protecting undamaged assets, but also in cleaning up the whole destruction and trying to get life back to normal as quickly as possible, was a hugely positive flag for people's economy. But that's why it's so important for this moment to be grabbed by Cyril and the ANC leadership to say, okay, we've seen this marvelous comeback. Now let's really convert it into a future in which we all participate.
That was a really interesting article by Joel Netshitenge of the Mapungubwe Institute. He sits on the ANC NEC yesterday, and he said the same thing, that people had come to the defense of their country, and this was a moment to be taken very seriously and to be studied, and I agree with that. From Daniel Meyer and Saeed Mohammed, a great debate here. Saeed Mohammed saying that we can learn a lot from the Somalian Business Forum of how to run entrepreneurial businesses. And I've seen it firsthand where my mom lives in Mayfair. And then Daniel is saying, that's great, but we've got to move beyond running tuck shops in townships. The value addition is sadly missing. We've got to make and fix things. Either of you?
Yeah, can I just let Mitch respond? Sure. I have a big thing about this, that we've got to merge the township economies into the mainstream economy. We haven't done that yet. And in that sense, we still have a form of economic apartheid in South Africa. We've got to be allow those incredibly gifted people that sit in Khayelitsha and Nanga and in elsewhere in the country to be able to crack it in the mainstream economy. And one of my heroes, which I always talk about, is Siubelela Zuza, who we interviewed for a scholarship at Anglo-American. And the incredible thing about him, he was educated at St. John's, was that he created a rocket fuel that was more energy intensive than NASA, and so has a minor planet named after him. How much have we shared that kind of joy about a person like this, which is far better than getting an Olympic gold medal.
I thought that was quite cool, though.
And it's those stories we should be using to energize people.
Absolutely. I don't know why we're quite bad news focused. Yes, Mitch?
Yeah, well, I'm an entrepreneur myself, starting a company called Growing Foxes, and then any entrepreneur out there knows that it is hard enough. All the obstacles that you need to face as an entrepreneur, it's incredibly difficult. It's not something for the faint-hearted. But that's why corporate South Africa, it's why government, it's why all key stakeholders need to make that job as easy as possible as they can. So one rule of the game that definitely needs to be addressed is access to financing. I think access to financing in South Africa is dire. And this is despite the fact that we have a very strong, deep, liquid financial market in the country. I know a number of fantastic entrepreneurs with really incredible businesses that have to jump through so many different hoops to get a slither of the financing that they deserve. So unless we come together and provide substantial financial support and opportunities for entrepreneurs, they're set up for failure. That's the one point. And then the second point...
At our banks, Mitch, if I can come in there? Our
say
banks,
again, sorry?
the GFIs, where's the problem? Is it that it's too difficult to lend by the private sector or the DFIs or where?
I think the venture capital market is incredibly small in South Africa. And, I suppose somewhat understandably because, there is such an unequal society that we live in. And so their opportunities to, scale up really, fantastic big businesses is quite limited. But, unless we have addressed that chicken and egg situation, we're not going to break through that barrier. But, coming back to that question around, we don't just want to set up tuck shop entrepreneurs. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And that's why underneath that entrepreneurship layer, there's a critically important layer that we need to get right. And it's blindingly obvious, which is education. Unless we build skills capacity in the country, then the limit of the kind of businesses that entrepreneurs can start is never going to be astronomical. They're always going to be smaller, small scale businesses. So once we address that bottom layer, that foundational layer around education, we're never going to get that exponential return on investment that entrepreneurship can garner.
Absolutely. From Charmaine Dadabai, I volunteered to be in the war room with Clem. Somebody else has asked, high road, low road, which you outlined a number of years ago. Did we take the high road? What's your view?
Yeah. We put on the table the high road, low road in the mid-'80s, high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and the low road of confrontation leading to a civil war and a wasteland. And it showed why scenario planning is such a crucial tool to consider multiple futures. Because if we just waved our finger and say, you've got to negotiate, people wouldn't have listened. But you offered them options. You offered them two scenarios. And you said, this is the kind of stuff you have to do to create the high road. So it generated a lot of enthusiasm. And we're in exactly the same situation now. It's not the political crossroads anymore. It's the economic crossroads. And you're not going to persuade people to create a people's economy by just saying, do it. You've got to say, here is an alternative scenario, because it really empowers people to choose between scenarios and say, what am I personally going to do about increasing the odds of the good scenario?
So you said people's economy and the Gilded Cage. Are those the two? People's
economy and the cautionary tale are the two ones we play in the book for South Africa. And the Gilded Cage is unfortunately the one that applies to the world at large at the moment, where the developed countries who are highly vaccinated and everything else have put a sort of cage around themselves to not so that they don't have too many illegal immigrants and so forth and so on. So we're not actually getting the kind of friendly planet that we spoke about in the letter to Bush, which is really required to handle climate change. You've got to look at the relationship between America and China, which are the two biggest economies in the world, the two biggest carbon emitters. At the moment, they're at each other's throats. They're not showing a joint kind of enthusiasm to get the rest of the world in line to handle this problem. And so, unfortunately, the Gilded Cage is a kind of negative scenario that the West is falling into at the moment, of trying to repel outsiders and sort of be the first to come out of the pandemic.
I thought that Biden was at least making an effort, but clearly it's insufficient for what's required at the moment. Sorry, Mitch, you were going to say?
No, I was just going to build off what Clem was saying. And I think a lot of people talk about us in South Africa being at a crossroads. You know, do we go down the high road or the low road, or the people's economy a cautionary tale? But South Africans and governments in particular mustn't think that if we don't go down the low road, we're necessarily going down the high road, because there is a third option. And if we do neither, we're just going to career into a bush at the end of the crossroads. And in many ways, that's the kind of scenario that is playing out currently in South Africa. It hasn't got bad enough to say we're heading towards the cautionary tale or low road, but it definitely hasn't got better to say we're heading towards the high road or the people's economy. And at the moment, we're going to slam straight into the sign in front of us saying high road, low road. And so I think, it's time for strong leadership to say, listen, this is the direction we want to take. How do we go down there and make sure that we end up in the best case scenario?
So did the events of 3 weeks ago shift that view, Mitch? Do you still see us as like meandering along, or do you think that we really could be headed to a low road scenario?
Well, I must admit, if we carry on with the analogy, after what was happening, I could kind of almost hear the GPS voiceover saying, do a U-turn, because we're heading down the low road. And I think it's too early to suggest that we're not. I think there were definitely positive signs in the response to that, don't get me wrong. But you couldn't watch what was happening in South Africa and not see that as a major flag indicating, the fact that things in South Africa aren't great, is both a symptom and a cause, what happened. And I think that unless we see strong responses to what happened, and we see some very clear policy making, and we see some, we see people that are part of it or were part of it, going behind bars, then you got to say that the flag hasn't gone back down.
Thank you very much. Lovely questions. I'm going to just do a whole lot of them because we're heading up to the hour. So Andrew Clare, so does the entrepreneurial economy equal the high road for you? Haugelo Moraka, Clem's point about the concept of a township economy is super valid. In reality, there is no township economy, but more the real economy and some peripheral economic activity called a township economy. And then a third one from Michael Gromit. Has anybody thought of including Gigi Alcock and his Cassie-nomics in future scenarios?
Well, I can't answer that one. Mitch may be able to answer that one.
No, that's fine. But maybe just Haugelo and Andrew's questions, that there isn't really a township economy, Mitch.
Oh, no, yeah. Well, let me just get back to this thing.
Sure.
I've been enough into townships when I was doing the high road, low road to realize there are just so many incredible little businesses going on in a lot of the shacks in townships. And gee whiz, it just mortifies me that that we're not actually saying, what can we do to really help you spread your wings outside? And we should be asking those questions. And as I said, we're going to have to hold people accountable for, doing things which lead to the opening up of our economy. And that's why I want the same kind of panel with the president reporting regularly on progress, because that then will hold people accountable. And as we said, it's about thinking and doing.
So a kind of, like we've seen with the ministerial advisory committees who've been so excellent. Mitch, can I get this one into you? How do you make plans for the future if you are so anxious about the president?
It's a very good question. I would say, and it might be a frustrating answer, that the process of thinking about the future, especially if you're doing it well, if you're doing it badly, it's going to lead to more anxiety. But the process of thinking about the future more effectively is something that will ease that anxiety. Why? Because you're reasonably thinking through your future. what could possibly happen, and then building in a resilience in your own ability to manage that uncertainty. And I think we need to get away from this idea, which is, a motivational fetish amongst, especially in advertisers for young people, that the way for the future and achieving success is to kind of doggedly, determinedly, and persistently go after your goals, no matter what. Obviously there's some good tenets there, but I think, adaptability is built, or resilience is built through adaptability, not just perseverance, not just putting your head down and going again, not just padding your jaw so that you can take more hits, but rather easing that anxiety through building a preparation in your own thinking. And it's something that scenarios are being used for more and more in the corporate space, is around how do you build in a healthier workforce by easing that anxiety of imagining, how the future may play out in different ways, because it definitely does calm the soul by, making sure that you're more prepared for what life may throw at you.
I must say, just doing some of the exercises was delightful for me as I read the book. From Kathy Hurley, Clem, I've not had the chance to get to your book yet, but I think you elaborate on the hedgehog and fox persona. He does. I'm involved in the reconstruction of rural towns in KZN. How do I find the foxes rather than the hedgehogs? And does Clem have any insight on rebuilding the social fabric of these towns?
Yeah, it's about regenerating a local economy. So the first thing that I would be doing if I'm looking at a rural town is, what kind of trades and services can we do to each other? It's been done in Australia and it's been done in America very effectively, where you try and create a local energy economy. And then obviously the good businesses that flow out of that can export to the rest of the province and then export to the country as a whole. But it's very good to start with a diverse economy where you've got people doing very different things, rather than trying to attract some very big business to set up a factory there, because then you've got the dependency on that particular business. So I really do feel that building things from the bottom up is important. And then how do you tell the difference between a fox and a hedgehog? And the answer is, probably it takes you 30 seconds of conversation. Because a flag goes up very quickly in the way a person responds to a question as to whether they're a fox or a hedgehog.
So, and you, a couple of questions here. Is our president a fox or a hedgehog?
Yeah, my view is that Cyril is a fox, because I used to negotiate with him when he was General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers, and I was...
Did negotiations take so long?
And he was a foxy negotiator, no doubt about that. And I think in many ways the way he's handled a lot of the troubles has been very foxy. So I definitely would put him in the fox category.
So we have to round up, but from David LePage, coordinator of Fossil Free South Africa. Why do no leaders, business elsewhere, speak out about climate, much less walking the talk in ways that would make them convincing? It's a long question, but I think that's the nub of it.
Well, I'll start on that one. The problem is, and Mitch and I have talked about this, that you have this sort of hedgehog devotion to economic development and increasing profits as the sort of main reason in life, and books written on increasing your wealth and so forth and so on. And yet we have reached a century which is totally different to every single previous century. We have 8 billion people now in the world. They're changing the climate. It is now absolutely vital to think of the sustainability of our planet as it is to think about economic development. It's not that you've got to focus on one or the other. You've got to find the right balance.
I see that happening in some places, perhaps not here, David. Thank you for a delightful discussion. The book is available on the Daily Maverick store. Clem, I'm going to ask you to grab your copy as I say thank you to everybody who joined us. And if you could just read the final, either of you, if you could read on 163, a final Spartan reminder for us to play out.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Mitch, and I have to hand this to Mitch. I mean, this was brilliant.
Come on, Mitch.
It's so I'll read it, but it is absolutely brilliant. We didn't want to end our book in a sort of like people do, sort of everybody lived happily ever after. We wanted to end with something that showed the true meaning of doing scenarios, and it goes like this. We have all along challenged the conventional motivational message that if you firmly set your goals and pursue them, you will define your future. This message in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it invites hubris, and hubris can lead to nemesis, which jeopardizes everything you may have hoped for. Here's one last story to drive that point home. Flush with victory after invading a number of city-states in southern Greece, King Philip of Macedon, father of the famous Alexander the Great, turned his attention to the powerful Sparta. He besieged the city and, confident of the outcome, sent an unambiguous threat to its leaders. If I defeat you, we will raze your city to the ground, we will kill every man and boy in the city, and take every woman and girl into slavery. The Spartans sent a one-word reply: if.
Thank you. Thank you both so much, and good luck with this lovely book. Thanks to our wonderful community of Daily Maverickers. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.